Hello and welcome to Global Order. My name is Ishan Dhar. In May 1995, the Chinese authorities abducted Gedhun Choekyi Nyima and his family members. Gedhun Choekyi Nyima is the 11th Panchen Lama, who was recognized and identified by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. At the time, this move made Ganden Choekyi Nyima the world's youngest political prisoner, and he nor his family were ever seen again. In an even more controversial move, the Chinese government went on to identify their own 11th Panchen Lama, another boy named Gyaltsen Norbu, a move that has haunted Tibetans and the international community ever since. But what led us to this moment, and what can we learn from it? Joining us today is Isabel Hilton, who covered these precise questions in her 2000 book titled The Search for the Panchen Lama, which tells us the inside story of what led to Ganden Choekyi Nyima's identification and the unhappy events that followed after. Isabel Hilton is the founder of the China Dialogue, among several other roles, and I urge you all to stay tuned for what will undoubtedly be a fascinating conversation. Isabel, welcome to Global Order. Thank you very much for giving us your time. It's very exciting to be able to engage you on the topic of the Panchen Lamas.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for your interest in this extraordinary story.
Awesome. Now, when one goes into your book, and it almost also serves as a biography of the 10th Panchen Lama in a way, which sets up the stage for, I guess, some of the unhappy events that took place later. But when one looks into the circumstances under which the 10th Panchen Lama was identified, and I know I'm somewhat oversimplifying here, but then later recognized almost at gunpoint by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama over his own preferred candidate, one can't help but draw, I guess, an imperfect analogy with what happened later in 1995. Yet the 10th Panchen Lama went on to become a great champion and defender of Tibetan rights within the PRC. How would you describe this transition? How did it happen?
Well, you're right. I mean, it does suggest parallels with later events. And you're right also that he became an extraordinary champion of Tibetan culture, of religious practice, and was deeply loved, actually, in Tibet. But maybe to understand it, it's important to understand some of the historical background as to why there was a dispute. I mean, it wasn't unheard of that there were disputes over reincarnations, because they're very important, both spiritually and politically and indeed economically. In the case of the 10th Panchen Lama, you have to go back to his predecessor, who had a quarrel with the 13th Dalai Lama. So the 9th Panchen Lama and the 13th Panchen Lama had fallen out. And they'd fallen out partly as a result of kind of the wider political situation. The Qing dynasty had fallen in 1911, 1912. Right. Tibet had been exposed to a lot of pressure, including from the British with the Young Husband expedition in 1905, where, machine guns had been used against, people who hadn't seen machine guns before. I mean, it was awful. So there was a sense that with the Qing dynasty collapsed, and one thing that the Qing dynasty had offered to Tibet was, as it were, protection. It was a priest-patron relationship where if the Nepalis invaded the Gurkhas, which they did from time to time, the Qing dynasty would send, reinforcements to the Tibetans and so on. With that gone, Tibet and Mongolia declared independence. And Tibet, as a state needed, without a protector, kind of needed an army. And so to raise an army, you need taxes, and the most powerful and richest institutions in Tibet were the monasteries, and particularly Tashilhunpo, which was the Panchens monastery. But there was a dispute over the raising of taxes. Essentially, Tashilhunpo, was suspicious of it all. And so the 9th Panchen Lama went into exile. When he died in exile in China, when he died in China, his entourage was still there, and they set about their own search. They identified a child. Meanwhile, back in Tibet, the Dalai Lama's court had also, identified, and the remnants of the Tashilhunpo hierarchy had also done a search. So that was the position. We essentially had two candidates.
Right.
Then you fast forward to 1950 when the Chinese invade. And so the PLA invades Tibet. They then negotiate what's called the 17-point agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet, certain irony in the title. That's negotiated between representatives of the Dalai Lama's government and the Chinese, by then the Communist Party of China. And items 5 and 6 on the list of 17 points for the peaceful liberation of Tibet are to do with the status of the Panchen Lama. So it was quite clear from then that the party regarded the Panchen Lama who was in China as a potential, useful asset in their relationship with Tibet. And so part of the agreement that the Dalai Lama's government had to sign recognized that Panchen over the Dalai Lama's preferred candidate. They were all very young at the time. However, it was a big political moment. So that entourage then came back to Tibet, were given equal status with the Dalai Lama under this agreement. Now, the Tibetan side did try to contest this because, even if the Dalai Lama was to recognize the Panchen Lama, it wasn't Tibetan tradition that the Panchen would have equal status with the Dalai Lama. However, they challenged it, but they had to give in the end. And so, the Panchen comes back to Tibet, and his whole entourage is regarded as closer to the Chinese.
Yeah.
He's recognized. He's a big figure. The other important thing about the 17-point agreement to understand is that it had offered a kind of one country, two systems, before Hong Kong.
Yes, it promised a degree of autonomy.
Precisely. It basically said that the existing Tibetan political arrangements internally would remain the same. So, you have a very kind of radical communist government coming in, wanting to remake China, but Tibet was to be left on its own. However, two Tibetan provinces had been separated from Tibet and given to Chinese provinces. So Kham and Amdo, Tibetan provinces, were given to Sichuan and Qinghai, and they had no protection from what then was a whole series of very radical socialist reforms. So, big attacks on monasteries, the disbanding of several monasteries, the expulsion of monks. A lot of people ended up in prison or in labor camps. There was looting. I mean, it was awful. There was a great deal of anger about it. And by the time you get to 1958, 1959, this has really built up.
Right.
And at the Monlam Prayer Festival, which is in March that year, all these people came to Lhasa, and the atmosphere was really terrible. There was a rumor that the Dalai Lama was going to be kidnapped by the Chinese, and at that point, the Dalai Lama flees with his entourage in disguise and ends up in India. Now that left the Panchen Lama as the most senior Gelugpa figure, and the Chinese then give him enormous high positions. So, he gets a great many very serious, he gets a lot of serious power. He was made president of the preparatory committee for the establishment of the Tibet Autonomous Region, for example, which was what Tibet was going to be called. He was vice chairman of the National People's Congress and so on. So he was clearly being groomed as a political figure. The problem was that he then becomes a kind of powerful figure, but in Qinghai and Sichuan, the Tibetan populations, previously under Lhasa, as Kham and Amdo, were subject still to these radical reforms. And by the time we get to the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s, 59, 60, 61, mass starvation has set in all over China, including in Qinghai and Sichuan.
Right.
And who do people turn to when they're, who do Tibetan people turn to when they're suffering? They turn to their religious leaders. So the Panchen Lama now is getting all this information about what's happening to his people. He's allowed to travel because he's a big political figure. He sends people to investigate. He goes to Beijing and he brings this up with Mao Zedong and asks him to modify his policies. Mao listens, but nothing happens. So then the Panchen, who was 24 at the time, wrote the famous 70,000 character petition to the Chinese leadership. In fact, he sent it to Zhou Enlai. And it is the most extraordinary, detailed account of the suffering of the people. As a result of that, he ends up in prison. So his move from being a useful
placement of sorts,
exactly, to opposition was really triggered by Chinese policies. And he was defending his people, and he went on defending his people. He went to jail for many years, and until after Mao died. He wasn't released until then. And when he came out, Tibet had been devastated. We'd had the Cultural Revolution and the socialist education movement, and the monasteries were in ruins. And he devoted the rest of his life to rebuilding the religious establishment. It was a liberal period in China, so he was allowed to do that. And I think there had been a lot of reflection at that point in the Chinese leadership after Mao's death on the mistakes that the Chinese had made in Tibet and the terrible effects of it. So, he became actually a bridge to the reconstruction of Tibet after the worst effects of Mao Zedong.
Correct. And what really struck me when I actually read what you had uncovered about the period leading up to this report, which I think Mao even called a poisoned arrow aimed at the heart of the party, was that he was advised by everybody, including his own tutors, I think even Nawang Jigme, and so forth. They all advised him against putting this in writing, and yet he went ahead and did it. Whether it was conviction, naivete, I'm not too sure, but there does seem to be a bit of a defiant streak that persisted even after, I guess I'm not sure he was ever politically rehabilitated technically, but at least when post-prison, when he was a towering political figure. To what extent do you think the PRC's, I guess, current determination to control Tibetan Buddhist reincarnates, are they somewhat haunted, do you think, by this defiant figure that they had? Do you think there's any connection or no?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that he was very much his own man, as you say. Yeah. But I think there's an institutional issue in terms of the party's relationship to religious establishments in general and Tibet in particular as an extreme case, if you like. I mean, essentially, the party does not tolerate rival poles of attraction or rival centers of power and influence or other ideologies. And, Tibet was a theocracy. The Dalai Lama was its spiritual leader, but he was also the head of state and government. And I mean, he was effectively a king. So the party had a choice. They could either destroy that system by force, which was mostly the approach under Mao as he became more radical. But that doesn't win you any hearts and minds. You set that course and you're kind of stuck with it. Or you can try and co-opt these leaders and use their influence and the devotion of their followers as an instrument to establish your power. And they started to do that right in the beginning. But then and then again from the 1980s onwards. So essentially, I think the party took the view that if you're not going to destroy, this huge cultural and religious tradition, then you need to control the leading Buddhists. And then you don't need to destroy the institutions as long as they obey. There's always a risk, of course, that they don't obey. Right. And as they discovered with the Panchen. So it becomes very important, to control those individuals. Now, the system of selecting reincarnates was also a system of education. So you'd find a child, he would go into the monastery, he would receive a religious education. He'd also receive, if he was a very big figure. He would receive an education essentially in politics, and the monasteries did education. They did, they did quite a lot of traditional medicine. They were important institutions. So if you were the leader of something like that, you also had that education. The party takes a very different view of the appropriate education of a reincarnate Lama, and has exerted, since the episodes that I write about in the book, much, much more direct control of the monasteries, with party committees, with enforced political education of the monks, with kind of constant demands for statements of loyalty to the party. And you see that, in all the interactions with leading spiritual figures. But it's a difficult choice, because, as I say, you either try to destroy the whole system, which in Tibet is very drastic, or you try to co-opt. Then what we're seeing at the moment, in addition to the co-option, is an erosion over time of Tibetan culture. So the banning, for example, of Tibetan medium schools.
Right.
So schools are now in Chinese, with Tibet as a kind of Tibetan language, as a kind of one element amongst others. So, and children are being educated in state boarding schools on a fairly compulsory basis. So they're separated from their parents. They're subject to, the Chinese perspective. So, we are seeing an erosion of, or at least an official attempt at homogenizing kind of everything within the borders of the Qing dynasty, which is now the People's Republic. And that's a new development, I'm afraid.
Yeah, just to fast forward to contemporary times briefly, in June, China's appointed 11th Panchen Lama, Gyaltsen Norbu, was in a meeting where he was summoned by Xi Jinping and 3 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, where apparently he was given a lecture or a speech about how he should be a good communist, should synthesize Tibetan Buddhism, and so forth. A couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with Claude RP, who's a French Tibetologist based here in India, who interpreted this as the CCP not being very confident in even Gyaltsen Norbu's loyalty to their agenda in Tibet, his reasoning being that if he were performing his expected role to satisfaction, why would he have to be lectured by, I guess, the very top? These are the bosses of the bosses in a manner of speaking. How would you interpret this episode?
Gosh, well, I have a lot of respect for Claude. He's a great expert. I think we're all guessing. I could suggest another interpretation, which is that since the Dalai Lama's own announcement about his intentions on reincarnation, it's extremely clear, and the Chinese government has been preparing for this for a very long time, that this is going to be a very big episode indeed, and that the Panchen will have to play a very big role in it. They might equally be concerned about how much personal loyalty he commands in Tibet, because, the point of having, if you like, a puppet, to put it unkindly, is that, it's effective. And if nobody loves him, then he's not effective. It's just a rather empty, a rather empty process. So I don't know. I mean, but I could certainly argue both cases, if you know.
Right. Now, coming back to, I guess, the life of the 10th and some of the things associated with him, one fascinating episode in your book is when you visited his Han Chinese widow and their daughter in their home in Beijing. And at the time, they were embroiled in a legal battle with Tashilhunpo Monastery in Tibet, which was, I guess, backed by the government in that legal battle at the moment. You also covered what happened with his daughter afterwards, and it's all very fascinating, and I'd love to get into it. How would you say that when we're talking about his family, and first of all, the marriages, of course, was very controversial. Perhaps you can explain why. And how did the family's relationship with the state evolve after that point?
It is, as you say, extremely unusual for there to be a family at all, because
Of course.
the tradition is that these orders are celibate.
Yeah.
The Panchen had spent many years in prison. He came out to this blasted landscape of everything he'd known, and he met and married a Han Chinese woman with some military association. So for Tibetans, even with their kind of
This was taboo.
it took a fair bit of accepting, to be honest. I mean, he remains the Panchen, but he was then not a monk. Because he'd married, and the couple had a daughter. So that was a very unusual situation, which on his death led to the equally unusual situation that you referenced, which is that normally the property of a reincarnate Lama goes to
his
the
successor.
reincarnation, exactly, the successor. But there was a family.
Yeah, there was a wife, a widow, and
a bloodline.
Yeah.
And of course they needed, they also felt that they had rights. So it was an extremely unusual situation, which I think was resolved in the end, pretty much to everyone's satisfaction. When I visited them, they were still living, and I think went on living in a very nice house in central Beijing by the moat, appropriate to the rank of the Panchen Lama, who, after release from prison again, was restored to, position of some dignity, and I think some wealth, and they have very much kept the Panchen, the 10th Panchen's memory alive. There's a shrine in the house. There's all visitors go and pay homage to the shrine. At the time when I visited them in Beijing, Rinji, the daughter, was still a child. She was 12 or 13. But as you say, I connected with her again much later when she'd gone to the United States to study, when she was a very poised young woman who had was very conscious of her role and her responsibility to her father. And that I think she has maintained. When she visits Tibet, she is given a very, very big welcome.
Right, and actually I should encourage anybody interested in this subject, they should read that profile. I think it was in the New Yorker,
Yes.
maybe in the mid-2000s when you did a visit her in the US. I mean, there was all that fun stuff. Steven Seagal was playing Loco Parentis in California and so forth.
Yes, that might come as a surprise, but remember at the time Tibet was extremely fashionable amongst the Hollywood elite, including
Right.
Steven Seagal, whom I once met in Dharamsala, dressed entirely in green silk, and it was quite a shock. He'd come in a car so big it couldn't negotiate the corners of the roads in Dharamsala. So there was a certain amount of comedy in this whole setup.
Right. But what did stick out to me was that there was an account in your profile about a meeting with her and the Chinese appointed 11th Panchen Lama, Gyaltsen Norbu, where she recounted that his aides, or perhaps the equivalent, were trying to get her to prostrate before him, and she refused to do so, citing that her late father never required it of her. So at least one could infer that at the time his family was not at least being useful to the state's attempts to legitimize their appointed 11th Panchen Lama in the eyes of the Tibetans. Granted, this was now in the mid-2000s. Have they been able to maintain the stance consistently?
Yes, I believe they have. I mean, the family seem to have they remain fairly integrated into the Beijing elite, and as I say, they very much keep the memory of the 10th Panchen alive, and that's almost their protection. They're very careful in what they say, but as you say, it's very notable that they have not endorsed the Chinese Panchen, whenever Renji goes to Tibet, she gets a huge welcome from the people. And I think it is a kind of popular way of saying,
where she's getting reverence that
she's getting the reverence
their appointed 11th Panchen Lama isn't.
Exactly. Yeah. And he's not. And I think that's, they have managed to maintain that, which is a real tribute to being careful and diplomatic, but using or relying on their, authenticity of being the 10th Panchen's family as their protection.
Do they still have these unprecedented royal honorifics that you had covered? I mean, that was a bit interesting. What was that about? Was that the government, or was that
I think it was a little bit self-appointed rather than the government, to be honest. I don't think that well, again, it's a completely invented tradition in the sense that there hasn't been a family,
ever,
so what honorifics do they get? So, it's all a bit strange. But the idea that she should be a princess is frankly a little strange.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, now coming to the identification of Ganden Choekyi Nyima, the 11th Panchen Lama identified by His Holiness, you went into great detail into the events that led up into that moment. And what I think is of particular importance and explains perhaps a lot of the dynamics of decision-making when it comes to these issues is, you talked about the fact that Chadel Rinpoche, the then abbot of Tashilhunpo Monastery in Tibet, started clandestinely communicating with His Holiness in Dharamsala. The Chinese government was intransigent about His Holiness's involvement in the process, and therefore Chadel Rinpoche proposed a subterfuge. Could you walk us through what that plan was?
Sure. As you say, Chadel had been put in charge of the search by the Chinese government. The Chinese government is always anxious to say we are maintaining religious traditions and eternal traditions. We can come back to that. But anyway, it was quite appropriate that Chadel should be in charge of the search. But because the Panchen is such a high position, and there is a tradition of mutual recognition between the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama, one of Tibet's fairly established practices. Chadel himself felt that he didn't have the spiritual authority to confidently make the final choice. He had a preferred candidate, he'd been through all the procedures, all the rituals, but he himself didn't feel comfortable because he regarded the Dalai Lama as his spiritual leader and wanted the Dalai Lama to make the final choice. So he smuggled the information to Dharamsala, photographs, the accounts, the reports, and he proposed to the Dalai Lama that when the Dalai Lama had chosen or identified the reincarnate boy, he would get the information back to Chadel. Chadel would continue with the Chinese procedures and make the announcement. The Chinese government would accept the announcement, and only then would the Dalai Lama reveal that he had made
been
the
involved all along.
Right. So, I mean, this was a risky business. One problem that the Dalai Lama identified was that he needed to be able to demonstrate that it was his choice, rather than him coming in afterwards, after it had all been decided, saying, oh, yes, that's fine, because he didn't want to concede the right to identify such an important any reincarnate Lama to the Chinese Communist Party, which is, after all, officially atheist. So,
Right.
That makes sense if we're looking at authenticity in spiritual terms. And because I had already been, I had proposed some years earlier to the Dalai Lama's office that I wanted to write a book about the search and make a documentary. So I had been, and I'd wanted to do it from both sides, but it became quite clear that the Chinese would find it quite difficult, to allow a reporter really to document this process from their side. So I had also promised to the Tibetan side that if they let me follow it closely, I would not disturb the process. I would publish nothing until it was over.
Right.
Because after all, I didn't want to disturb. I wanted to document, not get involved.
Of course.
So one day I was going to Dharamsala fairly regularly. I'd been to Tibet a fair bit, and waiting really for this whole story to play out. And I got a call asking me to go urgently to Dharamsala. So I turn up in Dharamsala, and it is explained to me, where we've got to in the process, which is that the choice had been made and the information was going back to Chabrel, but that the Dalai Lama wanted this documented in the documentary, wanted it filmed, because that would be his evidence that he had indeed made the choice. Because they hadn't actually told me this before I left London, so I had no film crew. I had no means of doing this. I had to find a rather surprised Swedish film crew who got tapped on the shoulder and told that they had a new job to do and they weren't to say anything. So we did that. We filmed it, and the messenger went back. The problem was that it all went wrong after that.
Of course, and we'll get into that. But before we do get into that, coming now into the role the Ganden Phodrang Trust will play in the succession of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, granted the circumstances are very different, yet there is some similarities when it comes to the gravity of the situation. Would you advise them to similarly document their search process? Would that be of asset to them at all?
Well, I'm an observer of this process, so I hesitate to give advice. But as a journalist, I tend to think that documentation is a good thing. And look, there are many differences in the situation. It would be,
of course,
very hard to imagine China allowing the Ganden Phodrang any kind of involvement in the search in China. I think that's just not on the cards. And of course, the Chinese search will be confined to China. And the Dalai Lama's wish is that his reincarnation his intention, should we say, his reincarnation will not be born in China. It will be born outside China. He says, it will be born under political freedom and so on. So we have, from the beginning, two parallel processes, and the battle will be for, which is considered authentic, if you like. Now, for the spirit, the Chinese will involve the Panchen Lama as evidence of authenticity, but we've discussed the fact that already he's not seen by every Tibetan as the real Panchen.
Right. He has a legitimacy problem. Yeah.
So they have a legitimacy problem, right? So legitimacy, if you're a believer, I would suggest would rest with Ganden Phodrang. But it's not, this wouldn't be the first time that the whole process had been contested. The history of reincarnation is that, because these are very high stakes, that there were disputes in the past, and there could well be disputes. This is the most high stakes. So I think that for those who are in charge of the search for the next incarnation of the Dalai Lama, honestly, I think that documentation would be an asset. We live in an information-rich world, and I think if there is a dispute, the authenticity will be challenged, not least from Beijing, very strongly. Then I think that every means at their disposal to demonstrate respect for tradition, the authenticity of the process, I think it would be a good thing.
Yeah, I think it could perhaps go a long way and could prevent a controversy, I guess, even within the exile community, which has happened with Karmapas, for instance.
Absolutely. These are highly contested procedures, and in the end, this is a battle of narratives. It's a battle for hearts and minds, and so openness and documentation can be pretty important.
And now coming back to the identification of Ganden Choekyi Nyima, His Holiness's candidate for the 11th Panchen Lama, the subterfuge that Shabdra Rinpoche proposed, of course, it didn't go the way it did. His Holiness ended up preempting the process with his own announcement. Now, when one reads your book, it seems that it was a mix of strategic considerations and esoteric factors as well, I guess, that prompted him to set that plan aside, take this big gamble with this announcement, the outcome of which is now sadly known to all of us. As in your reading, what why don't you walk us through the dynamics of that fateful decision? And in your view, was there a single factor that overrode all other considerations?
So we have to go back into Qing dynasty history a little bit here.
Sure.
The Qing dynasty, they weren't Chinese, they were Manchu, which is a
Of course.
northern tribe, and they revered the Dalai Lama as a spiritual leader, spiritual superior, and the priest-patron relationship I referred to earlier. In 1790, they also took a keen interest in the process of identification of reincarnation, and there was a dispute after the death of the 6th Panchen Lama over reincarnation, at which point the then Qianlong emperor, this is in 1792, ordered that in order that such disputes be avoided in the future, that he ordered the creation of 2 golden urns, one for Mongolia and one for Tibet, which he offered as a gift to resolve any future disputes. And the idea would be that in the event of a dispute, the names would go in the golden urn and be drawn from the golden urn, and that would decide. It sounds a bit like a lottery, but there were similar procedures. If you look at some of the practices in the identification of reincarnation, there's one where names are put inside balls of tsampa, that sort of
the barley dough. Right.
Exactly, the barley dough, and then the bowl is rotated, and one of them will jump out. And I've seen this, and it's fairly extraordinary. And whatever the name is inside that, and that's a kind of lottery if you are looking at it from an entirely secular lens. If you're looking at it from a spiritual lens, it was meant to happen. So you could interpret the golden urn either way. The Tibetans received it politely, and in fact, the Tibetans will say they rarely used it. However, for the successor governments, so in this case, the People's Republic of China, it became a symbol of state power over the Buddhist church. It was, and that was, again, it's another claim to authenticity, if you like, that the party makes. Look, we are just following the age-old tradition set up by the Qing emperor. It's always been done this way, and this is how it has to be done. So at the last moment, in the process, just when Chadril was planning to make his announcement, the word came down from Beijing that the golden urn ceremony was compulsory. Now, Chadril's position, as I understood it, was that it was okay. He was pretty confident he could fix it. And I can come back to how that might be done later. Right. But in Dharamsala, the anxiety was that the wrong name would be chosen. And that, of course, is both a spiritual matter for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's also a political matter. It's, he can't legitimately endorse the wrong name if he knows that, from his perspective, it's
somebody
not
else,
really authentic. So you had an absolute clash between, political needs, between convenience, between, what might be ideal diplomatically, and actually the spiritual kind of imperative of the right name being put out there. So the decision was made that he would preempt the announcement. I mean, I thought this highly risky at the time, but the argument that was put to me was that it could be seen as a kind of gesture of reconciliation, a kind of reaching out. The idea that both Dharamsala and Beijing should endorse the same candidate was clearly going to be, helpful, probably to both sides. But I very much doubted that the Chinese would accept it, and that, I'm afraid, is what happened. So that the Dharamsala made the announcement, and essentially everyone got arrested who'd been involved with the search in Tibet. So Chadril, his secretary, the person who had smuggled the information to and fro, and the religious establishment in Tibet was ordered to conduct a golden urn ceremony, which they duly did in the middle of the night, surrounded by troops. We have an account of that ceremony from somebody who was there, who subsequently went to the United States. So it's
Right.
we do know what happened.
You mentioned earlier that Shalda Rinpoche believed he could have somehow fixed the golden urn problem. What can you tell us about that?
So the golden urn is quite a large object, and the names of the candidates are inscribed on ivory tallies. Those tallies are put into quite tight-fitting silk bags, also gold-colored, and put into the urn. So the way to fix it, apparently, is that you pad the bottom of the bag of the candidate that you want. So it is very slightly longer than the other candidates, and you can feel that as you pull it out of the urn. Now, the interesting thing is that Ajahn Rinpoche, who is the person who
escaped later, yes,
who escaped
the
later,
Abbot of Kumbum Monastery, yes.
Exactly, and he was in the Jokan, in the temple when the ceremony was conducted, and he then was traveling, I think, back to Beijing, certainly on a plane with the Chinese officials who had overseen the ceremony and who were delighted with the result and so on. And in his book, he says that one of those officials, a man called Ye Xiaowen, was so pleased that he said, "Yeah, and we fixed it. We had the cotton padding in the bag." And Ajahn was very surprised that he should say that, said nothing, but he made it known later that that's what had happened. So even in the most, and of course, Gedhun Choekyi Nyima's name was not one of those names in the urn. So even in terms of historical precedent, if the golden urn exists to settle a dispute between candidates, Gedhun Choekyi Nyima's name should have been in there, but it wasn't. The parents of the child who was chosen were already in the temple and kind of stood up and did a kind of victory clap when the name came out. So, again, it did lack, it lacked conviction as a ceremony. And I'm afraid the problem is that, the Panchen, the Chinese Panchen has suffered from that ever since.
That's true. He certainly does seem to have a legitimacy problem that I don't think there is any way for him to really surmount it. Now, actually, coming to that, when we look at the Panchen Lama institution today, it's, I guess, fragmented at best for the moment. I mean, we don't know what the future holds. We are often told about how important, I guess, this tradition of mutual recognition is between the Dalai and Panchen Lamas. Now that the Panchen Lama institution is at least out of commission momentarily, does that in any way undermine the Ganden Phodrang Trust's ability to identify a successor that has legitimacy?
Well, the Ganden Phodrang has been very heavily endorsed by the Dalai Lama,
right.
and in the end, the Dalai Lama is the source of legitimacy at this point. So to that extent, obviously, it's an undesirable situation, but it's a situation that can't be resolved in this time around. At least we don't know, as you know, what the future will hold. And it is true that there was a tradition of mutual recognition, which goes back to the fifth Dalai Lama and his very close relationship with the Panchen, the first Panchen Lama. So, it has been a tradition, but as we've discussed, there were also disputes between these two great reincarnations in the past. And, these are contested processes. So I don't think that from the Tibetan perspective, it's none of this is fatal, if you like.
Right.
To their belief, as long as they're convinced that the Dalai Lama, this is what the Dalai Lama wanted, and after all, it is his reincarnation. And you get Chinese officials saying, well, the Dalai Lama has no right to say where he's going to be reborn. You think, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Surreal.
So yeah, I think it's not fatal, the whole situation. I mean, there are wider concerns, I think, for the future of Buddhism in Tibet than this. And So no, I think in terms for followers of His Holiness, I think Ganden Phodrang will have his endorsement, and therefore their choice will be regarded as legitimate, whoever that is.
Right. So now we're about almost 30 some years into this controversy. Gyaltsen Choekyi Nyima and his family vanished without a trace. No one seems to really know about their whereabouts and welfare. As the question of His Holiness's succession looms, what lessons do you think Tibetans, and I guess even the international community, what lessons do you think they should take from this unhappy episode?
Well, I think, the first lesson is never to underestimate how seriously the Chinese government takes this, and to be prepared for a great deal of pressure when these circumstances unfold, when there is a need for the search for the next incarnation. This will become a major episode between China and India, between China and other countries where there are Buddhist populations, or between China and indeed countries like the United Kingdom. China is quite clear about what its red lines are, what it considers its core interests. And China, the Chinese then do try to insist that other countries recognize China's core interests. So were that to be the case, then many governments would have to think very hard about their relationship with China and how important this issue of religious freedom, how important that was to them. So I think that is a lesson that people need to be thinking about. I know that the fate of Gedhun Choekyi Nyima has been a source of tremendous sorrow to the Dalai Lama. And I'm pretty sure it would have been an important factor in his own decision to announce that he will not reincarnate inside Tibet. And I very much doubt that he would like to see a situation in which there were contested candidates in Tibet and another child in his family might end up being disappeared, as Gedhun Choekyi Nyima and his family were. I'm an observer, I'm an outsider of these processes, so it's not really my job to give advice, certainly not to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But Tibetans live in a very different world now. It's a different world inside Tibet. It's a different world for them outside Tibet. They live all over the world, not in close communities anymore. There's been
a tremendous migration to the West. I mean,
there's been a big migration, and so their feelings about their language, their culture, their religious traditions will, I guess, be affected again by their own circumstances. So we are looking at a tradition that's playing out in a very kind of modern and fragmented world. And it will be different this time, clearly. But I think that however it is different, what I would hope happens is that Tibetan believers end up with a figure whom they can trust and believe in. I hope that this extraordinary culture and traditions, which are now probably flourishing better in India than they are in Tibet, can continue to flourish. And that over time, we might see a happier position in Tibet. But for that to happen, I think that there has to be a process of identification of the next incarnation of the Dalai Lama. That has to be that incarnate has to be protected, has to grow up in his own religious and cultural traditions. And then for the future, well, we just have to hope that things get better.
Isabel, that was most insightful. Thank you very much for a fascinating conversation.
It's really been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.